Okay. Okay, we're going to get started. Hello, everyone. I'm Lisa Ridge, the president of New Jersey Humanist Network. I want to thank everyone for joining us today, whether you're in person or at the Franklin Township Public Library in Somerset or via Zoom. NJHN is a 501c3 nonprofit educational organization founded in 1994 that provides, supports, and promotes humanist community in New Jersey. We're based in Somerset County and have members and supporters all around the state and the region. We host programs and events that support our educational, political, and social goals. We embrace reason, ethics, social justice, and philosophical naturalism, and committed to our understanding of the universe, solving of problems through our compassion, common experience, and civic engagement. We support progressive ideals and encourage lifelong learning and respect for the natural world and our human diversity. I hope you had an opportunity to view our news and upcoming events on the slideshow, but if not, stick around and we'll run it again at the end. There's a lot of activity coming up, like our book club on the 26th, our Exploring Humanism discussion on critical thinking on November 5th, and our Human Light celebration is in the planning stages for December 17th. When we get started today, the Zoom chat will be disabled during the talk, maybe, and we'll open it afterward, and we'll get your questions during the Q&A. For those in the room, please hold your questions until the Q&A as well. So I want to introduce today's speaker, Dr. Juham Navarro Rivera is a political scientist, writer, public speaker, and research consultant, a leading expert in the demographics and politics of non-religious Americans, and the author of Secular Politics Newsletter, where he explores the intersection of secularism and politics. He's the managing partner at Socioanalytica Research, a research, polling, and data analysis consulting firm. His research has been featured in national and international media, including the Washington Post, NBC Latino, O Globo, which is Brazil, the Times of London, and Reforma in Mexico. He received his BA in political science from the University of Puerto Rico and his MA and PhD in political science from the University of Connecticut. He has been a senior fellow of the Institute for Humanist Studies, a research scholar and instructor at El Instituto, Institute of Latin America, Caribbean and Latino and Latina Studies at the University of Connecticut, a research associate at the Institute for the Study of Secularism and Society and Culture at Trinity College in Connecticut, a senior policy analyst at Demos in New York and Washington, D.C., a research associate at Public Religion Research Institute, or PRRI, as most of us know it, in Washington, and an assistant research scientist at the Center for Community Health Research, Hispanic Health Council in Hartford, Connecticut. Please see Juham's curriculum vitae on his website for a full list of all of his extensive writings and publications. So please welcome Dr. Juham Navarro Rivera.
Thank you for having me. Good afternoon. I'm gonna talk today about the Latinx secular revolution. I'm kind of like workshopping this title. I've been using different terms to talk about this, but the gist of the argument has been all these changes that have been occurring in our community in terms of religion, and particularly the fact that a lot of people are either abandoning, stopping, or I like to call it becoming more sincere about the fact that they are not religious and actually just saying it so. And a lot of people who are growing now, younger generations who are growing up as non-religious. And, it's something I've been looking at for almost 20 years, at least 15 years, since I started grad school and I got my gig at Trinity College, working at the Institute for the Study of Secularism. And so, I'm going to talk a little bit about like what we knew then, what we know now, especially jumping off of earlier this year, the Pew Research Center released a report on Latinx religious identification, and they found that about in their count is about 30% of Latinxes are non-religious. So that made the rounds in the news for a while. So I became a minor celebrity in Chicago. I was in 2 places in Chicago talking Chicago PBS. Later, I was at a progressive radio station in Chicago, and then my local paper, the Washington Post, actually interviewed me to discuss this issue. But it seems to come and go. So it's kind of like feels like a fad, and a lot of people are focusing on other things that are not Latinx religious identification. And so this is what I mean by Latinx secular revolution. So some of the earliest data that we have, it's from 1990. That's the National Survey of Religious Identification. And then in 2008, I work with Professors Barry Cosmic and Ariela Kaysar on the American Religious Identification Survey, which is essentially the continuation of the 1990 survey. I was 11 when we did the 1990 survey, so I wasn't working on that one. But one of the things that got, so these has, between, it's essentially one generation between 1990 and 2008, the proportion of non-religious Latinos doubled. Then the Pew Research Center released their religious landscape survey in 2014, and that by then they had 20%. I kind of like doing those comparisons because the methodology of the ARIS and the Pew surveys are slightly different, but they usually had similar results when they were conducted around the same time. So, they kind of like validated each other. And then Pew released some data that they collected late last year, and they released it earlier this year, and they now find that it's 30%. So we have like a process, a time frame of just over 30 years in which like the percentage of Latinos with no religion has gone from 6 to 30%. We're talking, of course, here about adults, so people 18 and over. Most of these surveys do not interview children. And so, it has been a sea change, even accounting for the growth of the Latinx population in those 3 decades. It's essentially surpassed the growth of the population. But we still have to deal with the stereotypes. And in this case, I use an image. It says Vaya con Dios. That's my hometown of Bayamón, Puerto Rico. When you come in, this sign says, welcome to, or bienvenido a Bayamón, welcome to Bayamón. When you go your way out, it says Vaya con Dios. And it's like, yeah, Godspeed, literally. And I use this sign because it's it was put in there when I was about 15 or so. So it has survived several hurricanes, so maybe God is actually protecting it. But I remember, this is one of my first signs that I was kind of like an atheist. One of my first internal signs. I was very uncomfortable with that sign. And I was like, I remember one time driving by with my parents, and I was like, that sign shouldn't be there. And they were like, why? And I was like, well, because it's religious. And they're like, it's not religious, it's about God. And I was like, yeah, okay, maybe you guys are not my audience. But yeah, essentially, like it's a generic God thing. And of course, everybody believes in God. So it's not a bad thing, right? Like it's not giving a preference to no one, because of course everybody believes in God. So it's not a Catholic thing or a Pentecostal thing or anything else. It's a thing that everybody does, which of course is not true, as I later discovered through myself. But still, talking about those stereotypes, I still get questions about like, what parish do I go to? Or people assume that I'm a Catholic. Or just these stereotypes that we get as Latinos overall when we get into politics, for example. And the last part of the presentation is gonna be heavy on politics and how the Latino knowns are transforming the politics of the Latinx population, or the Latinx cohort. And it's essentially this assumption which I used to kind of like deconstruct when I was teaching Latino studies, that Latinos are all about faith, values, and family. And these discussions or these assumptions actually just brought out a lot of Latinx knowns. And if you look at in the way that, for example, the Pew Research Center has historically presented the findings of their surveys about Latinos, and especially when they write about knowns, and sometimes about Protestants, sometimes I actually join forces with Protestant Latinos when discussing like Pew survey releases, because they usually talk about Catholicism as if it's a default, and essentially Latino identity and culture is defined by Catholicism. And so the knowns are and the Protestants, Pentecostal, evangelicals are treated like as outliers and the weird thing, and the people who are rejecting the culture, and so sometimes I join forces with them, fighting off these kind of framings. But they're still out there. I just a couple of weeks ago just had a conversation with some Harvard students, the Harvard humanists, their Student Secular Alliance chapter, and they were telling me all these stories, and I was like, yeah, happened to me like 20-25 years ago. Same thing still happening. People assuming you're a Catholic, people assuming you're a conservative, right? Because this is where the politics parts go. It's like that assumption that Latinos are conservative because Latinos are religion, and Latinos are, even if they're Catholics and they're like very socially conservative, which the survey research has found like for eons that is not the case. And yet we hold on to those stereotypes. But essentially the Latinx knowns, the non-religious ones, are actually shattering all that, and for that we get called as kind of like underhandedly the traitors to the culture. And even when it's interesting, this year a few of the articles about these survey research results were very good. The Washington Post article was very good, interviewing Latino knowns and kind of like getting their points of view. But I remember like 10 years ago, a friend of mine was the subject of an article in which they called his mom, who was religious, and kind of like put him on the spot. It was a radio piece, and a lot of the articles are kind of like put us always on the defensive. So I was ready to fight when I was talking to these journalists, and for the first time, and I would say like almost 15 years, it was the first time I didn't have to fight with a journalist talking about the Latino knowns, or having like to fight some stereotypes. Like there's some younger journalists that I don't know if they're not religious, but certainly are more sympathetic, and I think that has helped a lot. The way that the issue has been covered especially in this last round of news. And so this is a little version. This is the report that we released in 19 nothing. I was in college. In 2010, based on the 2008 survey. So one of the things that I noticed when we were analyzing the data was like the 12% of Latinos were non-religious, and got my attention because I realized I wasn't alone. And for the longest time, I thought I was the only one. And so Dr. Cosmin and Dr. Kaiser actually suggested, we should write about this. So we ended up doing a report about the changes in Latinx religious affiliation back in those days. And so here's where we have the changes from 6.4 to 12.4. And you see, like it's a doubling of the population percent-wise. But of course, the Latino population had doubled between 1990 and 2008 overall. So essentially, the secular Latino population was 4 times larger. So it grew at twice the rate of the Latino population overall. So you had a lot of changes. The other thing that happened, which I didn't circle there, but is that the Catholic percentage was still a majority by then, but it had declined 7% or 8%. 6%. I subtracted the wrong numbers. And then the other Christians, which was mostly used, evangelical, Pentecostals, other Protestant types, had actually flattened. It went from 25 to 22. And this is one of the things that a lot of people were talking about at the time, was this transformation, this switch of Latino Catholics converting into Protestantism. There was a whole scholarship about that in the 80s and 90s. And especially that assumption that the Protestantization of Latinos was going to lead, like that was like when Reagan was talking about Latinos are natural conservatives, that was he was working off this assumption that Latinos were going to become Protestants in a way, and they were going to become, Republican voters. But essentially what was happening at this point was that Protestant growth was plateauing and the nones were on the rise. But nobody wanted to talk about that. Now, this is from the latest Pew report, and as you see, this is a question about the childhood religion. It's a chart using 2 questions. It's childhood religion, current religion, and the change that has happened. And of course, like in the case of Protestants, more people have joined than had left, but it's not that much, right? Like 9% of Latinos have joined Protestant denominations or Protestant churches, or identify as Protestants because they don't necessarily have to go to a church. And 6% have left. 23% have left the Catholic Church in some way or another. But 23% of Latinos have left the Catholic Church. Only 1% have joined, who weren't raised as Catholic. But with the nones, it's like 3% of nones have become religious, and 20% of people have left a religion to become non-religious. So these is those 2 ovals, red ovals, are kind of like what I've been emphasizing for the last decade or so, is that there's this assumption that Latinos, Catholics, are leaving Catholicism to join Protestant churches, but that hasn't been the case for at least a decade. Some people are still doing that, but twice as many are actually abandoning religion altogether. And this is where these conversations about the future of religion in the United States come to, because even though a lot of people may be leaving religion for political reasons, and that means that, I think we need to send basket of flowers or some candy, spots of chocolates to Jerry Falwell and their ilk, because like the politicization of religion, of the religious right has actually helped the growth of the knowns in a way. It shows that they just not have, it's interesting because people are leaving religion, but they're not going toward more liberal religions. They're actually writing off religion altogether. And so it's a very different, when people talk about the spiritual but not religious, and the people who are holding on to beliefs, it's not, if they were holding up to to Christianity, to Christian beliefs, they will be joining something different, some new flavor, new brand of more liberal Christianity that will fit their, but they're not. They're just writing off religion altogether. And there's a lot of distrust about religious organizations. And so this is what's happening also with Latinos. It's like they're just not joining more conservative religions. They're actually just leaving religion altogether. And that is particularly centered among the young. Like, the over the last, since I've been writing about this, like it's been at least 15 years that the younger generation, it's less religious than the previous one. I'm not sure how long that's gonna keep going, but with Latinos, like right now, about half of people under 30 are non-religious. So this is a lot, right? Especially with the assumption that all these people were raised religious, which we're gonna see in a little bit is not the case. And it changes a little bit, but as you go down or go up in numbers, but the people who are English dominant or bilingual are much more, like at least twice as likely as those who are Spanish dominant. That has to do a lot with immigration and the fact that a lot of immigrants identify as Catholic, or many, especially from Central America, are already evangelical, Pentecostal, whatnot. As you can see, they kind of like have the highest percentage of evangelicals, because a lot of those Spanish dominants tend to come from countries where evangelicals have taken are even a plurality or a majority. Among U.S. born, again, it's like they're the most likely to be non-religious, and then in here, as we see, as they were raised, what we're saying is that 13% of Latinos were raised as knowns, but among the youngs are 26%. And this is the number that I've actually talked a little bit, because when the report came out, it was a little swept under the rug. And one of the things I wanted to highlight was the fact that like a quarter of young Latinos. So it's not that they're abandoning religion, they're not abandoning Catholicism. It's that they are growing with no religion. And I made the point that if you look at their ages, this is the people who either were born or were kids when a lot of the big Catholic Church scandals started coming out. So I think at the time there was a lot of discussion about the future of the church, and I think we're seeing it right here. It's a lot of people stopped taking their kids to church, and a lot of people are being raised as non-religious, and that probably will continue. I think there's a snowball effect that's going to be happening in here, in the sense that a lot of people are just not, the young people are not living religion. They're just never were in there, and that. I think that's less of a problem for us to study. It's a problem for the religious to study. For us is to understand where they're coming and what they need and what they want to do. Maybe they don't care about, maybe they're apathists. They don't really care about religion, which is not a bad thing, from my perspective anyway. And then this last part is going to be a little bit more about all these, how this is transforming Latino politics, and this assumption that they were going to be more conservative and more, especially going into 2004. I think the 2004 election was political science, we call it a critical. It should have been a critical juncture, and a critical juncture is this event that actually foresees a greater societal change. And so in 2004, there was all this news about 40% of Latinos voting for George W. Bush re-election, and that that was gonna that eventually, like the Latinos were gonna, the Republican Party was gonna get higher and higher level of support of Latinos, and it was gonna be a swing vote, if not eventually a solidly Republican constituency. So in here, I'm comparing two Pew surveys at the 2014 landscape and the recent one. So I was, that those data are now publicly available. And as you can see, like only among the evangelicals have the Republican Party like gain a stronghold, in the sense that they can be considered Republican constituency. So the partisanship has shifted. I think with the polarization of the country, a lot more people are choosing a side in terms of political parties. So the percentage of people who have no leaning. So it's that the question is asked in two parts. It's like your partisan affiliation, and then if you are an independent or identify with another party, they will ask you if you lean toward a party, Republican or Democrat. So the proportion of Latinos who have no lean of any religion has declined in the Pew surveys in those 8 years or so that between the both surveys. And this is important because what is happening is that the evangelical, the Protestant cohort has not grown, right? It's the same. So what we're seeing is an aging cohort that it's becoming more conservative. The Catholic cohort has become more Democrat, as has done the non-religious, which is still the least likely to identify as partisan. So there they have the highest proportion still of people with no lean. At least in these surveys. And then when we look at the 2020 election, so this is taken from the Associated Press podcast. This is a humongous pre and post-election survey that they conduct, kind of like it's their way of doing an exit poll. Nowadays that it's harder to do exit polls, and they do it completely online. And their sample is like over 100,000 people, so there's a good decent size of folks in here. And as we see, like the knowns were the most likely to vote for Biden. The Protestant, other Christians, most of which are evangelical, kind of like split between Trump and Biden. That has been the pattern historically for this group, but they have, especially this survey didn't have like a really good evangelical variable, so I couldn't separate them, but other surveys would have like, evangelicals like going 60-40 for Trump. And that's an interesting shift in which like you will have them maybe 10 years before being kind of like a swing vote, and now they have become a solidly Republican voting cohort, even though they still have a chunk of Democrats in there that also get lost in the conversation. And it's not just, the party identity of those voters. So the knowns are the most likely both to, well, 3 times. Like they're the most likely to identify as Democrats. They're the least likely to identify as Republican, and they're the most likely to identify as independent. So they're a lot of the knowns, not just the Latino knowns, but knowns in general, have weak partisan alliances, especially with the Democrats. So they're more likely to call themselves independent than Democrats oftentimes. So you have more leaners than independent, solidly Democrats, and even with Republicans, that is also the case. The nones are less likely to be solidly in one party. The same with ideology. The nones are the most likely to identify as liberal, but they are also very likely, and their plurality is to identify as moderate. Now, I don't know if it's a contradiction or the self view of people doesn't really fit their attitudes. So a lot of people who identify as moderates, you start probing into policy preferences, so they're not really that moderate. So people consider themselves moderate, but they are not really that moderate. Or maybe it's that they consider themselves moderate, and the policy solutions that we consider liberal are actually moderate and not really that far-reaching as they should be for many of these folks. And this is, for example, with abortion, which, you know, this is the 2020 elections. This is 2020 voters. Latinx nones are the most likely to be in supportive of legalized abortion. Of course, the least likely to identify to be opposed or in favor of illegal, making abortion illegal. In fact, the Protestants, mostly evangelicals, are the ones who only a majority to do that. As you can see, 60% of Catholic Latinx voters are in favor of abortion. So it's, one of those stereotypes that doesn't have to do with the nones, but also has to do with how politicians think about these constituencies. And the fact that Latino Catholics have never been a very conservative voting cohort, not socially, not economically. Latino Catholics are not white Catholics. Concern about climate change, I put this because going back to my days in PRRI over a decade ago, Latinos were always the most concerned about climate change of any ethnicity or race. I think it has to do a lot about transnational ties. In my case, I'm Puerto Rican. Like we have at CBA, Hurricane Maria, but a lot of people, I can think of my wife is from Mexico. We listen to a lot of Mexican radio online, and you can hear all these PSAs about the effects of climate change, and or even in the museums, you see a lot of public education about climate change, the stuff that you don't see here. And so I think it goes that travels. So even Latino Protestants, which are more aligned with the Republican Party, for example, are 70% are concerned about climate change. Voters, and Catholics is like 81, the nones 88. The role of government, whether the government should do more to solve problems or it's doing too much. Latinos overall have always been more into the activist government, but Latino nones are most likely. But even a majority of Protestants would say that the government should do more to solve problems. Of course, these questions have like a little problem in the sense that we don't know what it means to be more. Oftentimes, maybe the Protestants will agree with policies that means that churches can partner with the government to do stuff. These kind of Office of Religious Affairs and the stuff that presidents have had, where they kind of involve churches in these kind of issues, which of course secular voters are not necessarily in favor of. And then, a more recent and very present issue, the nones are in favor of more strict gun laws, so as Catholic voters. With the Protestants, they are a plurality. They are in favor of more strict laws. But they're the most likely to want less strict laws, so they want to loosen the gun laws, which again, kind of they're twice as likely as the nones to want that. or they're fine with, a third are fine with the status quo. And so some are those are the issues that and the thing is, I wanted you to think in terms of, as the size of the Latino nodes it keeps increasing and the size of Catholics and Protestants keeps shrinking or plateauing, like you're gonna see that Latino politics is gonna shift, and I think you can see like the change between the Bush years and the Obama years, in which there was these expectations with Latinos were gonna become more conservatives, and in fact it didn't happen, was because the growth of the Latino nodes was actually counteracting with their more liberal politics, the more conservative politics of the group that was supposedly be growing. So I wrote a little bit about this in the newsletter. When I started at the beginning of the year, it was weekly, but I took a summer break that I wasn't planning on. But we did a lot of unexpected travel that summer, and then I got a lot of work being a contractor. Sometimes you have like an ebb and flow of work, and I've been very busy since the summer. So the posts have been less regular as they were like in the spring and early summer. But I hope as we get toward next year and election year, doing some analysis and writing some more, not just about Latino nodes, but also about the nodes in general and the politics of the nodes. From the newsletter, if any of you are subscribed to Free Inquiry or members of CFI, there's an article adapted from the newsletter called the Boundaries of Secularities, in which I write about how us as, I was a board member of AHA and also was in, I've been involved with several of the organizations, including CFI at some point. What I feel that even as the growth of nodes has happened, like I feel that we have kind of like squandered that growth, and whether we have just focused too much on the people who are solidly atheist and convincedly atheist, and not done much outreach to the people who are hostile or distrustful of religion, but are not ready to call themselves atheists, even if attitudinally they are, but they can't get past the stigma that there is about the word and the people. So that's in Free Inquiry. I also, so Paul Fidalgo, the new editor of Free Inquiry, interviewed me for Point of Inquiry that actually came out this week. So that in their podcast, I'm the latest interview with Paul Fidalgo as host. And I think that's it for now. So if you have any questions, please feel free to ask. And yeah, thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
I have a question.
Okay.
I have a question on the first two charts that you put up. So if you want to go back to them, you can.
This one or this?
Oh no, you're after that. I'm sorry. I think it's after. It was the survey, right? The survey ones, right? Actually, right. The one before this, I think, was the one that I was asking about. Yeah, I guess the one thing that you could see a big change is in the don't know refused line. And I wonder, and it sort of goes to what you're saying is the last thing. I mean, those are people that might have become non-religious, but don't feel comfortable saying they're non-religious because of any repercussions that there might be with that. Is that your feeling with that there?
Yeah, so this is just from the Latino subsample of the ARES. We had a growth just also in the survey nationally of don't knows at that time. And yeah, my assumption was, these are transitional knowns. And I think as it also depends a lot on the way you ask the survey. So the thing about the ARES is that the question was open-ended. So it was, what is your religion, if any? and then people will write. Now, the reason the knowns are known as the knowns is because most people wrote known
Right.
in that category. And, and so, it was a composite. And then you have a lot of people who would say, I don't know. But what
Mhm.
that means is like, we don't know what that means. So, but that percentage of don't knows actually increased a lot. I haven't gone back to other surveys because they're asked very differently. So, for example, the Pew survey just gives you a list, but doesn't give you don't know as an option. So it kind of like forces you. And so I haven't actually do an analysis of that. Don't know. Also, people assume I'm a sociologist. So if I were a sociologist, I would probably go deeper with that question. But I'm a political scientist.
Mhm.
So I've thought about it, but not that deep. But yeah, that's one thing that we discussed in those days when we were analyzing the ARIS with the NSRI 1990.
Mhm.
That jump of people with don't knows probably was a lot of, and now since the knowns, at least being non-religious or saying that you're non-religious has actually become more acceptable, at least in surveys. Like people have no problem saying it. Like that, I think that's part of the growth. Probably a lot of those don't knows have converted to knowns and haven't gone back, or haven't gone back to say don't know. It's just like they're solid now in the known category.
Yeah, I wondered if at that point they were afraid to say the no.
That may be true. Uh, because at this point we're at a time in transition, right, in which like a lot of, and that includes me, like I was an atheist and I didn't know many people who weren't, and then like, I think a lot of people realized they weren't alone after that.
Okay, hold on. Joe, you have your hand up?
Yeah, I had a question on.
Joe Sipigora.
Oh, okay.
Sorry, you guys can't see that.
Yeah, we did actually. Is she on?
Joe, you're muted still.
Oops. Thank you for the presentation. Nowhere in the polling is there a mention of age groups, nor if they are, if they're U.S. Latinos, breaking it trying to break it down between those who have come from other countries in the last 10 years or 20 years or 30 years, as opposed to those who, like, in other words, they might be first or second generation Latinos, or let's see, that was it. And income levels. Can you speculate a little bit there? Or I can guess
so I
some
don't
of it.
have to speculate about the first part. I just put up the graph again.
Oh, I was 10 minutes late, so
okay.
I missed the whole part. Okay, sorry about that. I'm sorry. Okay.
So yeah, like the younger cohort, and I think that, this is true for everybody, not just Latinos.
Yeah.
Yeah, so they're more likely to identify as non-religious. So half of the people under 30 essentially are non-religious.
Yeah.
To answer a little bit back to the previous question, if you can see the no answer proportion in here, it's very small.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So I think that tells you a little bit of which direction that is going. And yeah, like, so this one has like, whether you were born in the US or not. With Pew, I'm not sure, for example, if they ask me, I don't remember if they'll classify me as US born or foreign born, because I was born in Puerto Rico. And yeah, like these places are very arbitrary of how they classify us. And you have no idea how much problems I had to do research on Puerto Rico when I was in grad school, because neither my professors in American politics or my professors in comparative politics thought that Puerto Rico was a subject that applied to their fields. It was not American politics. Oh, it's not comparative politics. That's a U.S. territory. Oh, that's not a real, like, that's not a state. So it's not technically an American politics field. I was, okay, never mind. Shouldn't have asked. But anyway, but yeah, so yeah, the more like, that, so people who are US born are twice as likely as people who were born outside the United States. You can say it with language also. So bilingual or English dominant Latinos are more likely to be knowns. I think it has a lot to do with uh uh especially churches are, and if you look at this I mentioned briefly, that foreign born evangelicals are like, or evangelicals are more likely among the foreign born, and it makes a lot of sense because a lot of our most recent migration is coming from countries that are either majority or plurality evangelical, like Guatemala, Honduras, El Salvador, where I may say not only that they're majority evangelical Pentecostal, but U.S. forces like the late Pat Robertson and their ilk are very responsible for that, supporting dictators and the not in those areas during the Civil War. So yeah, so there are those differences. I don't think Pew added anything from income in this survey, but I think class and class and like language go hand in hand together. So it wouldn't surprise me if like income would look like English bilingual, Spanish dominant.
Here in the library has a question.
So, thank you for your presentation. This is really great data on the United States Latinos. But do you know if these same trends are being mirrored elsewhere in Mexico and Central America and South America?
Yeah, so it's so it's not a U.S. phenomenon. It's a global phenomenon. And right now, my wife and I are under contract to write a book about Latinx humanism. And one of the things we're working on, it's like making those transnational connections, because there's all these assumptions that the people are very religious in these countries, and to some extent they are. But for example, my wife is from Mexico City, and everybody's Catholic and nobody's, right? Like, like everybody like goes to the, they celebrate their, I don't know, the baptism, and they throw a party and like but I mean, people don't go to church and like probably don't pray. They just kind of like, these things are, it's hard to separate what is cultural inertia and how much is actually religion. And so, yeah, the number of people who express no religion, and of course this all varies because international surveys vary in methodological quality, and also how different countries measure religion, the one who do in official statistics. But for example, it's interesting because Mexico is one of the least or have one of the lowest amount of knowns in their official statistics, but it's a country which probably a richer secular tradition constitutionally than the United States. They are officially a secular state. My wife went to public schools in Mexico, and like, they were very adamant. I mean, Mexico didn't have diplomatic relations with the Vatican until the 1990s, after the Mexican Revolution. It was like 75 years in which the Vatican broke with Mexico, which is why it was such a big deal when like John Paul II went over there back in the 80s. And so Mexico, I think attitudinally is more secular than their official numbers. Then you have places like Uruguay, which is like not just the most secular country in Latin America, it's probably the most secular country in the planet. Depending on, again, how you count, it may be a plurality or a majority of the population is non-religious. And then you have places like, in the Caribbean, Central America, where like there's a lot of U.S. influence, and by that U.S. influence means a lot of U.S. media, a lot of U.S. missionaries. So you have a strong Pentecostal and evangelical presence in there. And so you have a lot more stigma with people, but that talking about the when I was talking with the Harvard students a few weeks ago, one of them was talking about his experience being in Colombia. It's kind of like in Mexico, everybody's Catholic and nobody is. And so I think a lot of people are coming out as non-religious, but I don't think that probably tells you much about the religiosity of the country, because a lot of people just are nominally religious, especially Catholic countries. That is probably the norm, which there's a lot of inertia, religious inertia going.
One of our vice president of NJHN, who's in the library today, is from Uruguay. She's nodding emphatically about her home country. Maybe she'll have something to say after I call on Alex.
Oh, thanks, Lisa. William, thank you very much for this presentation. Actually, this particular slide that you have displayed, which someone else asked about, was one that I had a question about too. And it doesn't surprise me, right? You're seeing this movement towards secularism among the younger, those born in the United States, those who are more integrated into the economy by virtue of being English dominant or at least bilingual. It's really not surprising. And I think those of us like me who teach at the university level, we see that among our Hispanic Latino students. Religion is not even a factor in their lives, by and large. The one question I had for you about this was actually a couple. First, I imagine these surveys, do they deliberately exclude, to your knowledge, anybody who's Brazilian? I'm just by truth in advertising, I'm Brazilian. Yeah, that's always a question I always have. Is like, are we including Brazilian Americans or not? Do you know?
I think yes and no. So yes, because I don't think there's an assumption that Brazilians are Latinos, but also no in the case that they ask self-identification as Latino. So if a Brazilian identify as Latino, then like they'll be counted in. Yeah, that's an excellent question. In Hartford, there's a huge Brazilian population. And so I met many Brazilian Latinos. And then here in DC, I met several Brazilians who sneer at me when I suggest that they're Latinos. So
yeah, and you know why? A lot of it comes down, I mean, there are a variety of reasons, but part of it is language. What I tell people is I'm Latino, but I'm not Hispanic. And then, which of course to an American makes no sense. They don't understand the distinction. Not to stereotype, but it's a confusing distinction.
Yeah, and that's actually why I prefer usually use the term Latino. I think it's more inclusive.
Right.
Right. And that it technically you can also include Haitians in that category.
Right. Absolutely. Right.
But yeah, like it is, and I think it also has a lot to do with integration. Like the Brazilian community in Hartford, it's in the middle of a very Latino community. Like, there's a Puerto Rican neighborhood next door. There's a lot of growing Mexican, Guatemalan population in there, and Dominican population. So they're integrated into Latino communities in which the very segregated communities here in DC aren't.
Yeah. Now, related to that, I did have one question precisely about, recency of immigration to the United States versus being native born. Have you, and I think one of the people in the room might have asked this question, so apologies if I'm repeating it. I'm interested in political movements in South America, particularly Brazil versus, well, today there's an election in Argentina. In Ecuador, there was just recently a presidential election in which a relative conservative was elected. There's a good chance that Milei in Argentina is going to be elected, and he's hard right, extreme right wing. Brazil, I couldn't help noticing in Brazilian elections where expatriates like myself are legally required to vote, that the Brazilian community in the United States sometimes might actually vote more conservatively than back home. So I'm curious as to, when you look at, for example, US born versus foreign born religious affiliation, who tracks closer to everybody back home in Argentina, Mexico, and everywhere else? Is it that the foreign born Latino population in the United States is kind of like the most conservative of the three groups?
You know, I don't know. I think sometimes it wouldn't surprise me. And I was having a conversation yesterday, but it was my kid's birthday party. So I was having a conversation with other parents. And somebody started talking about Latino politics, and well, I had to interject because and I think one of the interesting aspects of Latino politics is, you know, where these people are coming from, and where they're like, you know, you have both people who are running away from, or who are descendants of people who are running away from or ran away from right-wing and left-wing dictatorships. And then you know, depending on the wave, right? Like, if you have a wave of let's see, I don't, you know, I don't want to make assumptions in here because I'm not sure, but in, you know, there's a lot of element of class in a lot of these waves, and culture. So for example, I would say that a lot of the Central American population that has a you know, big core of evangelicals, and I think that this is really interesting, especially because people don't think about how religion affect all these things. I think there's a big element of class in which, like, you know, people who are better off are usually more conservative. And so that wouldn't surprise me that immigrant communities in the US, where you have a diaspora that is highly educated, like the South American diaspora, tends to be very conservative. But also you have this element of religion, which in which, for example, Central America has been so shaped by US politics, including their religion, that it wouldn't surprise me if, you know, people are so conservative in terms of their religious views rightly aligned with US right-wing politics, that even people who are nominally of the people, that, you know, nominally should have like some sort of left-wing politics, will be right-wingers, or closer to the, you know, more conservative by virtue of their religiosity. And I don't know about that, and now you got me thinking.
Yeah,
But thank you. Yeah.
you draw an interesting distinction between class, economic class, and also recency of immigration. I think, for example, the Cuban American diaspora from the 1960s, 70s, politically very different than, let's say, Brazilians who emigrated to the United States in the 1960s at the height of Brazil's military right-wing dictatorship.
Yeah.
So politically, they're going to be very different from each other.
Yeah,
They're going to vote very differently.
Yeah, and even I think even more closer in time is Dominicans who left the Dominican Republic during the Trujillo years, and Cubans who left during the early Castro years.
Yeah.
You know, kind of like the same kind of people in a way,
Right.
economically, but ideologically they're total opposites.
I don't want to step on anybody else's time. One quick last question. What I love about this is that it highlights the difference between evangelical Protestant and non-evangelical Protestant. I'm being, again, Brazilian. I'm hypersensitive to this because the largest single voting caucus in Brazil's national legislature is evangelical Christians. They actually are a more powerful voting bloc now in government than Catholics. And so Brazil is ostensibly still the largest Catholic country in the world, but a very large share of the nominal Catholics aren't really Catholics. They're evangelical Christians. And so I'm wondering if that's something that you're seeing in any Spanish majority community any Spanish language where maybe the evangelical church has made big inroads in terms of leeching off Catholics. I mean, broadly speaking, it's very good to see so many Catholics gravitating towards non-affiliation, but I'm wondering if there are any exceptions to that.
Yeah, so so that's one of the things, and I, you know, so it's interesting because I don't know what's your field.
Economics.
Okay, so you know, when I was in college and my early years in grad school in the late 90s, early 2000s, and even before that, like there's all this literature of the growth of Pentecostalism and evangelicals in Brazil and Central America. And there was all this scholarship that because they were becoming Protestants and with a lot of US missionary money going into that you know, that was going to help these countries to become more democratic. Because they were going to replicate democratic US institutions. And to me, it was like, are you crazy? These people are fascists.
Yeah.
And so, but of course, like I'm a lowly grad student, and like, you know, it was like, I mean, it doesn't make sense. I mean, these people are friends with Pat Robertson. Have you seen Pat Robertson? And so it was very annoying in those years. And like, unfortunately, time has given me reason that, you know, like they you know, these are very dangerous movements. So yeah, so you know, there was this false assumption that, you know, these change, you know, from the Catholic, very hierarchical Catholic Church, anti-democratic, was going to make these countries more democratic as they became less Catholic. But of course, you know, this is the assumption that people cared about the hierarchies of the Catholic Church to begin with. But the other thing that you mentioned is like these, and there's a political scientist at the University of Texas, David Leal. I'm not sure if he's still running with that line of inquiry, but there was a lot of these, especially Pew surveys, that they ask this born again question to everybody. There's all these cohort of Catholic, born again Catholics, and they were like Catholics who identify as Catholic, but they were very similar to evangelicals in their kind of like their beliefs. I'm not sure. I'm sorry. I'm trying to go back here. Yeah, I'm not sure to what extent those like born again Catholics are not a thing anymore, and they're just born again Christians, or you know, they are appalled by the liberalism and the left wing politics of Pope Francis, for example, and whatever that means, and you know, have become Protestant. But the other thing is that the growth of Protestantism in the United States among Latinos in the United States has stalled, right? Like it's usually people who converted. If they converted like in the 70s, 80s, 90s, during the heyday. And now those Protestants are either them, their children, their grandchildren, but they're not really converting people at this point. Like a lot of people are former Catholics who are becoming knowns or are actually sincere now about their lacks of religious identity, and there's some coming from the Protestant to known pipeline, but it's a little different to become a known after being a Catholic, because you know it usually doesn't mean much to leave the Catholic Church. But a lot of these Protestant churches are you know, tend to be smaller, more family, like family, friends, neighbors kind of type. So the social cost of leaving those, it's much larger than just leaving a parish from a priest you don't like it.
Yeah, you're ostracized from the community.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, this is tremendous cause for hope. Thank you so much for this presentation. I mean, it certainly makes me, as a Latino but not Hispanic, very hopeful for the future.
Accomplishment, actually, for Alex to be.
Yeah,
Anybody
I'm not
else?
hopeful about much in this country these days, but this is cause for hope.
Bill, if Bill has a question
Yeah.
in the library?
Can you hear me? Okay.
Yes.
Looking at data online, I really don't see much difference between the Latin community and the non-Latin community within the United States. It seems like you see the same kind of trends in both communities. So I guess the question is, why highlight the Latin community particularly?
Sorry, what was the question?
He's asking why, if the numbers for Latinos are similar to everyone else, why highlight the Latino community?
Yeah.
Well, one, because it's my community. That's important to me. But also because there's all these stereotypes that, you know, the Latinos are just ridiculously religious and that living religion actually excludes you from being a Latino. And what we're seeing is that is not the case. People still identify as Latinos and they like send religion to the garbage bin. And I think that you know, the fact that we can live with that duality in our heads, it's a strong message, because I mean, for so long, being religious, and you know, for even a longer time, being Catholic has been equated with being Latino. That these breaks are important to highlight, not just in the case of because it's a trend that is national, yes, but it also means that, you know, these younger generations are redefining what it means to be Latino. And that religion is not part of that new definition. That there's something that holds us together, and that Alex, I love it. You know, I'm Latino but not Hispanic, 100% with that. That's why I don't really like that term Hispanic. It's very exclusive, and you know, like building it's like people are finding that they identify with it as part of this community in some way, in which the assumption that you have to be a Catholic or you have to be religious or that you have to have some sort of woo-woo faith has to be a defining mark, and that is not what we're finding. It's like these people, these young people, especially, know who they are and know what they aren't.
Okay. Anyone else?
Yeah, Lisa, I just wanted to, this was the other slide, I think, that I was talking about. And I guess I was thinking about the movement of the Catholic, you know, out of Catholicism to mostly unaffiliated. And I was thinking more of causality. And in fact, I thought this was an earlier survey. I noticed now it's 2022, but I was wondering if a lot of it might have been reaction to the church abuse scandal, and if that was a cause for a lot of movement out of Catholicism.
Yeah, so I have suggested that the problem is we don't have, especially because, like, you know, these organizations are not going to ask you explicitly about that. You know, there's grant money at stake if you go too deep. But yeah, I mean, I think there's an argument to be made that, you know, when all these scandals came up, and you know, they continue to come up, when they started coming up like 25, 20 years ago, I think, you know, there's a lag in the reaction. So you're not gonna see like people just leaving churches initially. I think one thing is that people had started to do it, and I think probably all the bad news has not helped. But particularly what I see, to me, the big number is this one, because it's like that 26% of people under 30 that are, so it's 1/4 of young people under 30 who were raised non-religious. Now, if you look at the numbers, like, these people weren't raised by non-religious people. Like, at some point, either they were raised by religious people And if you look at especially the people 50 and plus, like only 7% are non-religious. So most of the people were not raised by non-religious people. So either Catholic people, Catholic parents didn't take their children to church and grew up with no religion because they didn't want them to be in, in that environment, in that institution. Or their parents also stopped identifying. Which makes a little sense because you see like that 30 to 49 kind of like cohort, it's actually wrong, it's there. So I think that there's an element in there. I think there's part of people also like becoming more honest. But especially among your people, I think the effects of all the Catholic scandals are in there. And I've been talking to people, and I'm hearing now this term, which I think it's a future known term. It's kind of like when we got the question about the don't knows at the beginning of the Q&A. I think I keep hearing this term a couple of times from different people who call themselves liberal Catholics. And then they start talking to me and they're like, you sound like a known who hasn't left the nest. And I think it goes along with, like all these, Catholics are very liberal in their politics. And one of my theories, like, I came of age in the 90s. I went to Catholic schools through the 90s. And it was an interesting time. And Alex, you know about Latin America. So when I went to school, the teachers wanted to have it both ways, in the sense of, this respect and the authority of Pope John, what's the name of that guy? John Paul II. John Paul II. I forget. JP2, as I call him. But also like these, it's still close enough in memory of all these liberation theology kind of movements that happened in the region in the 70s and through the 80s. So you have that little balance of this very conservative John Paul II kind of like papacy, continued then by Benedict. But also this memory of the option for the poor and the bishops of the 60s and 70s and even Vatican II. And so you have like that push and pull that I think in my former school eventually won over the conservatives, because like a few years later, my brother's in the same school and like it turned very conservative. But I think that there's some. I think there's some element in the Catholic to known pipeline. I'm trying to work out these arguments, especially for the book my wife and I are writing of Latinx humanism. That there's some vestigial liberation theology Catholicism in there, in which like a lot of the former Catholic now knowns are down with a lot of the Catholic social teaching, but they are not down with the politics of the Catholic bishops. And it's like, we should be more about redistribution of wealth and taking care of people and using the government power to like, to make life easier, kind of like heaven on earth, as they used to call it in the old liberation theology days, instead of like trying to fight abortion. And the gays, like kind of like the fight over sexuality and reproductive rights. Essentially, the Catholic politics have become essentially gender. It doesn't surprise me, which is an institution led by cranky old men, solely cranky old men. So.
Can I offer an explanation for why that might be? Just a point of inquiry. When you think about, the 70s, the 80s, and the 90s, the Latin American experience is very, very different
Yes.
to that of the United States when it comes to abortion rights.
Yeah.
No Latin American country had Roe v. Wade.
Yeah.
In Brazil, it is still a criminal offense.
Yeah.
So, this creates a paradox. Abortion was never a political fight.
Yeah.
It was simply not. Nobody talked about abortion. Rich people got abortions overseas or illegally. Everybody else got a back alley abortion and died. And it was never talked about. So what did that lead? That left no political venue for the Catholic Church in Brazil or other countries. Meanwhile, you have military dictatorships in Argentina, Uruguay, Chile, Brazil, and so many other countries. So the Catholic Church does exactly this. São pelos pobres, as we say in Brazil, the option for the poor. It's not fighting abortion rights. That's not a fight.
Yeah.
It's fighting on behalf of poor people. And so the experience of Latin Americans of the Catholic Church in the 70s and the 80s was a very liberal, socially progressive church when it came to economic rights. Abortion was simply not on the table. It's actually very interesting now because now abortion is an issue. And in country after country, you're seeing an advance in same-sex marriage rights, abortion rights, divorce, and other things, because the Catholic Church, has been caught flat-footed on this. The folks who are fighting abortion rights and same-sex marriage rights in these countries, they're not the Catholic Church, it's evangelicals.
Yeah.
So it's a
importing
very different
responses.
historical experience between the United States and Latin America.
Yeah. No, yeah, absolutely. And it's, that you mentioned that the option for the poor, it was like, the Catholic Church option for the poor and the poor option for the Pentecostals. The same.
Yeah.
Okay, anybody else? Bill?
Yeah, just one thing. I wanted to point out that I think it's wrong to refer to these unaffiliated people who've left different religions as being non-religious. Although the surveys haven't been done in the United States, the ones that have been done in other countries have showed that many of the people who've left these religions still retain elements of that religion. They tend to call themselves spiritual. They tend to believe in life after death. They tend to believe in miracles. And this is just a general trend. But I just think it's wrong to refer to them as non-religious. They're just non-affiliated.
And this is where I'm.
But that also depends how you define religion. And I think that one of the problems is that we are living in a post-religious transition in which, like, what means to be religion? What means to be religious is very different. And I also disagree a lot in terms of, like, this was my, this is the heart of my Boundaries of Secularity article in Free Inquiry, which is like, what are we as secular organizations are willing to accept as non-religious? And are we gonna begrudge people for not shedding everything of their former beliefs if they're still like work? So do we want adults, or are we willing to deal with children? Essentially, like, do we want grown atheists who know all what it is? Or are we willing to work with people who are like, I'm leaving this community. I don't know what I believe anymore. I may have some sort of like supernatural, and how much is, how much danger is in embracing people who read horoscopes. I think reading a horoscope is much less dangerous than like peddling homeopathic like pills. One is potentially lethal healthcare alternative, and the other one is a hobby. And so how dismissive are we going to be to people? Like, how welcoming are we going to be? Because one of my problems with the secular movement has been that historically we're not very good at making alliances with even religious people who may be our allies in other areas, because we're just so on our high horse that we're smarter than everyone else, that we cannot deal with these morons beneath us. essentially. And by the way, the religious right, which are the morons beneath us, run circles around us all the time politically.
Right, right. That's definitely where NJHN is. You know, we've evolved to that point where we know the conversations that we want to have and the ones we don't, and we know the issues that matter and the ones that don't. So, and there are organizations, national organizations that work on all these, you know, different areas about separation of church and state, and yet we need to be more concerned with, you know, people's general, you know, care and safety in the world, and not so much about what the existence of God. We don't have those conversations anymore. Or the one I'm used to hearing is, you know, what secular movement, what atheist movement? There's no movement. I'm like, here, let me show you how many organizations exist to fight for the rights that you want and demand, but don't seem to be willing to organize to, you know, fight for them. So unless you're going to understand what's going on, you know, if you're not part of this movement, that's fine. Just
No, and I think, you know, that's interesting. I don't know if you guys have had or know who Sarah Levin is, of Secular
So, yeah.
Societies. We have been talking, she and I have been talking about especially these, trying to discourage people who to use the herding cats analogy about secular people, because I mean, you know, there are secular organizations, like they're long, like, you know, the AHA is 80 years old, like American AHA is 60 years old, like CFI is over 50 years old. So it's, you know, these are not new kids on the block. There has been a movement. I mean, is this as right as the Christian Coalition? I mean, as big as the Christian Coalition? No, that doesn't mean it doesn't exist. And you know, and people have organized, like, you know, we don't have the coffers to fight a lot of these things, but that doesn't mean that there aren't people working for it. And so, like, every time we hear somebody from the movement using the terms of herding cats, we just want to punch them.
Oh,
And it's like, you know, yes, people are working hard. People are doing a lot of work. You know, there's at the local level more than at the national level. There's a lot of local stuff that people don't know about. Just because people don't know about doesn't mean that it doesn't happen.
right. And we're talking about things where, like, clergy project that's helping,
Yes.
you know,
Yes.
clergy leave leave that profession and not lose everything that they've, you know, acquired in their life. There are, you know, now there's the secular therapy project for people who want to make sure they have access to a therapist who's not going to recommend spiritual, you know, advice. And there are organizations for Black non-believers and Latino non-believers and people who are looking for that community. There's, you know, so there's a large number of organizations that are meeting needs that non-religious people are asking for because they're not finding it. Grief support, right? Pet grief support, secular support. Various, I know Alex and I have talked about this a lot, for people with diseases and disabilities that get into these support groups that are very religious. And so there are many people who have needs, and we're growing to address those. And so
And I appreciate it. It's and I think that this is the kind of work that needs to be highlighted, not just dismissing, you know, like these are people who don't join anything, and, like, you know, the organized secularism is a misnomer or an oxymoron. No, it is not. Like, people are organized. They have billions of, they have a billionaire behind that. It's like, you know, paying off Supreme Court judges on the side? No, we don't have anybody like that. But there's a lot of blood, sweat, and tears going into everyday activism.
Yep. Yes. And you are definitely one of those.
Oh, well, I was thinking about you guys, but thank you.
So I don't know if anybody else has any questions, but if not, I have made available, at least on some social media, some of the article you're talking about in Free Inquiry, the podcast you just did on Point of Inquiry. What else? There's, you and Sarah. There are YouTube videos.
Yeah, we were in Chicago this summer at the Netroots Nation talking about engaging and understanding the knowns with in Netroots Nation 2023 in Chicago. So that there's a couple of interviews there that we did.
Right. So, and I really appreciate the work that you do, and I'm glad that we were able to make this available, and hopefully we'll get this on our YouTube channel. And so if nothing else, I'm just going to say thank you very much for being with us today.
No, thank you for inviting me.